Okay, hi everybody. True story, I just did this tutorial in its entirety, and my screen recording software was cutting off the entire layer panel. So we're gonna do it again. Yes, technology, I love it. So we are going to do this entire composite in this tutorial. We're gonna start from scratch. We're gonna go all the way through color correction and finalizing this to look really good. This is going to be quite a lengthy process. Feel free to pause it, continue it as we go, repeat steps if you absolutely need to. Otherwise, let's get started. So we're making a composite image. And again, composite images take images from a whole bunch of different places and we combine them to create something that communicates an entirely new meaning, a new scene. In this case, I've given you guys 8 individual images. They're available for download in Unit 4 under the in-class exercise called Snowy Composite or Snowy Castle. Download those now and go ahead and open them inside of Photoshop as separate tabs. And again, you do that by going to File, Open, and then open them from wherever you downloaded them to. And once you've done that, you'll see that we have 8 separate images here of images that we're going to combine and merge and make into something brand new. To get started, however, we have to make our new artboard that will drag everything else to. So let's go ahead and do that first. Let's go to File, New. Let's go over to Web. We're going to be working in a Web Large preset. That's 1920 by 1080 pixels at 72 dpi resolution. Hit Create. And now we have our blank artboard that will start to bring everything else to. Now, to get started, it's good practice to always look for a foundation image as you guys start to find images for your composites. A foundation image should be the most grandiose. It should be the most complete, something that we can add everything else to. In this case, in these images that I've given you guys, Mountain 690104 is the best foundation image that we have. The reason being, it's the most pulled back, the color looks the most complete, and it's the most grandiose that we can add everything else to. So we're going to use Mountain 690104 as our foundation image, but we got to start by bringing this foundation image into our Untitled 1 artboard. Now, depending on your screen resolution, Photoshop only displays a certain number of tabs. It doesn't mean that it's closed projects that don't show up there. It just means that it's hiding them underneath these double arrows over here to the far right. When we click on that, we can see every tab that we have open. So even if it's hiding, you can toggle back and forth this way as well. So let's start by selecting all, edit copy, and let's paste this into our Untitled 1 artboard. Now I was generous and I found images that were similar sizes to our Web Large preset, so you guys don't have to resize this for now. So let's go ahead and rename this layer Mountain Back. And to do that, we double click the layer name in the layer panel and rename it. Now we're calling this Mountain Back because we're going to have a series of 3 mountain ranges: Mountain Back, Mountain Middle, and Mountain Front. So let's get Mountain Middle in there. To do that, we're going to go to our Alpine tab. Looks something like this. Let's go ahead and unlock our background layer to start. Now we want to isolate the mountains away from the sky. So we basically want to get rid of the sky. And our first thought would be, well, let's use one of our lasso tools, maybe use our quick selection or magic wand tools. And you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that, but that's going to create more work than necessary. There's a lot of really fine edged ridges in here that we really want to keep. So let's use select and mask instead. If you guys remember, select and mask is up here in the option bar. And it appears anytime you have a selection tool selected. Any of them is fine. So with your background layer unlocked and one of your selection tools selected, let's enter Select and Mask. This enters the Select and Mask interface. Now, I'm working with the red overlay that allows me to see what's highlighted and what's not. If you want to make yours look red if it's not already, we change that over here in the Properties panel to the far right. Under View, we can toggle this down and change it to Overlay. It defaults to onion skin. Okay. Now, with our quick selection tool over here to the far left, and a brush that is decently sized, 60's fine, I'm going to simply paint on the mountains and everything beneath them so as to get a good isolation. So in this case, everything except for the sky has been selected. Now before we hit OK, we have to make sure that we're outputting to a layer mask. Now it should default to that. Mine defaulted to selection from our previous my previous session. But we want to make sure this is set to layer mask. This will ensure that everything is non-destructive as we go to isolate. Once that says layer mask, go ahead and hit OK. Perfect. Now, your first inclination here is going to be to go to Select All, copy, and paste it into our new Untitled 1 artboard. But we run into a problem here. Let me demo this real quick. Don't do this, just go ahead and watch me. I'm going to go to Select All. I'm going to go to Edit Copy. I'll jump over to our Untitled 1 artboard and I'm going to paste. Oh, what is that? Well, here's what happened. Let me go back to Alpine. I had my layer mask selected over here on layer 0, which means when I selected all and copied, it copied the layer mask. So you may think, okay, well, let's then select the regular part of the layer and let's copy and paste from there. So I'll copy, I'll use Control-C to do that. Jump over here, I'll delete this layer and I'll paste. Hey, the sky's still there. So just like pasting the mask, this is pasting the entirety of the image unmasked. So we've now run into a problem. How is it then that we get a layer with a mask on it, copy and paste it into a brand new artboard? Let me delete this. We have to do so through a new method of duplicating. So I showed you guys how to duplicate a while ago. We can click and drag any layer down to the folded corner icon, release, and it duplicates itself. I also showed you the long way, where you right-click on the layer name, you go to Duplicate Layer, and you'd hit OK. Except this time, in the Duplicate Layer window, we notice that we have a destination and a document pull-down. This pull-down allows us to tell Photoshop which artboard that we have open to duplicate this image to. So if we choose Untitled 1, this will literally duplicate our layer with its mask over into Untitled 1. So I'm going to hit OK. Visually, nothing has changed here, but if I jump over to Untitled 1, get out my Move tool, you can see that we now have a duplicated layer with its mask still intact. This is a great way of copy and pasting layers with masks on them. Oh, freaking out there. Now, let's go ahead and drag this right about there. Okay, let's go ahead and name this layer by double-clicking its layer name, Mountain Middle. Good, so let's do that whole process again with Mountains 863700. And this will become our Mountains front. So let's go ahead and unlock our background layer by clicking the little lock icon. Let's select one of our selection tools. Let's go to Select and Mask. And same thing, Let's paint on the mountain ranges and everything beneath them. Don't worry so much about the ones that are kind of back here. Those are irrelevant. Just get a decent selection on these foreground ones. Got some of the sky here. Using your left and right square bracket keys, those are underneath your plus and minus, allows you to change your brush size as you're working. Okay. All right. Make sure you're sending this to a layer mask on your Output 2 pull-down menu, and then hit OK. Perfect. Now let's port this over to Untitled 1. Right-click the layer name, duplicate layer. The destination document should be set to Untitled 1, and hit OK. Nothing changes here, but when we jump over to Untitled 1, behold, we have our mountains front. As you guys are positioning this, go ahead and drag it to cover this kind of dark triangle of trees here that's on mountain middle. Kind of like that. And let's name this mountain front. Good. So 3 separate mountain ranges. We've learned how to duplicate a layer into another artboard so we can maintain its layer mask. Now let's jump over to the castle. We're going to do the exact same process for the castle. Unlock the layer, get out a selection tool, enter select and mask, and using a size that is appropriate, begin to paint on the castle. Now, you don't have to get super exact here. We don't need the trees on either end of it, so don't worry about those. Like I don't even need these over here. Again, using the square bracket key to change my brush size. Holding Alt and using my mouse wheel to zoom in and out. Holding spacebar and clicking to navigate around my image. And then to get these individual really thin spires, I'm going to use the Refine Edge brush over here underneath our Quick Selection tool. And I'm going to start painting over these. Now we're going to be shrinking this castle down pretty small, so don't get too caught up in the fine details. And we're going to output this to a layer mask. If you guys want to spend some time refining your different edges on your castle, that's fine. You can hit pause here before we move on. Once you like where your castle's at, output it to a layer mask, hit OK. Beautiful. Same thing. Let's duplicate the layer, right click, go to duplicate layer, and send it to Untitled 1 under the document destination. Hit OK. Let's go over to Untitled 1, and now we see a nice large Hogwarts amidst the snow. Let's name this layer Castle. Now we need to scale this down. I really want this castle just to kind of sit nestled into this area and mountain back. So we're going to use free transform to scale the castle down. Let's go to edit, free transform. If I zoom out, I can see the bounding box of my castle. And while scaling, to ensure we don't squash or squish our castles, we should hold shift to maintain proportions. I'm going to scale my castle down. I'm going to use some opacity so I can kind of see where I'm placing this. And right about there looks pretty good. So you guys can kind of see where that is sitting. Okay, I'll turn the opacity back up to 100% and I'll hit enter to apply my free transformation. Now, the goal here is to make the castle appear like it's sitting behind this part of the mountain. And currently it's not. It's got a very flat bottom to it. So we have to use a kind of creative way of masking to achieve this cutout. Now this process can be a little technical. Bear with me. Repeat it as many times as you need. That's the beauty of a tutorial. This is a great way of making layers feel like they're interacting with a boundary that doesn't exist. In this case, the boundary is this line of the mountain, and we want our castle to appear behind it. Now some of you may be thinking, we'll just drag it behind the mountain. Well, the problem is the sky is part of mountain back. So if we drag the castle behind it, it's actually behind the sky as well. So to get started on this process, let's go ahead and turn off the castle layer. We don't need it. Not yet. And then select mountain back. What we want to do is we want to use select and mask to get a nice selection line going around this part of the mountain. So with the selection tool selected, let's go up and get into select and mask. Now, don't worry, we don't have to sit there and do the entire mountain range, just the area the castle is interacting with. So I'm going to start to paint onto my mountain range. And just an area about this big. Doesn't have to be much more than that. Now, because the sky and the mountain range are similar contrasts, you'll have to kind of get a little bit more detailed here. Good enough for me. You guys can make that as perfect as you would like. And I know some of you will spend an hour on this alone. Okay, now, before we send this off, we have to make sure that our output 2 is set to selection, not layer mask. And this is important because we want to make sure that we have a selection line, not a mask by the time we're done with this. So selection, and then hit OK. All right, so we have this dancing selection line around this ridge. This is exactly what we want. But remember that selections are layer independent, meaning they affect the layer that's been selected in the layer panel. In this case, we're going to go ahead and bring our castle back by selecting the eyeball. Now you can kind of see where we're headed with this. This selection line will literally become the cutout line, the kind of the scissors path, that will mask out the bottom part of the castle. So I'm going to select my castle. Now, in order to mask this out, we have to actually apply the existing layer mask because we can't double stack masks, unfortunately. So to make this permanent, we can apply the layer mask. Now again, only do this on layers that you are absolutely certain you're not going to have to pull more information back later. In the case of the castle, we already selected everything. There's not going to be any bit of the sky or trees that we're going to need. So we can go ahead and right-click the mask part of the layer, the black box over here, and do apply layer mask. And when you apply a layer mask, it makes it permanent. It merges the two, and now it's just a destructive isolation. And that's okay because now we can apply a brand new mask that follows this cutout. Now to add a new layer mask with an existing selection, all we have to do is hit the new layer mask button down here at the bottom of the layer panel, the black dot in the white square, or as we've affectionately called it, the Japan flag. However, if I click this now, look what it does. It follows that path all right, but it's masking out the wrong part of the castle. I'm going to undo that by hitting Control Z. And what do we have to do now? We should inverse our selection. So let's go up to Select in the menu bar. Let's go to Inverse. And now, on our castle layer, let's apply a new layer mask. There it is. So by using the outline of the mountain, we've been able to cut out or mask out that part of the castle to make it look like now the castle is behind the mountain. It's a really nice trick. Now if you were confused there, you can go back, rewatch that part, follow it through. It's a good thing to kind of have in your arsenal of tools to make it look like layers are interacting where otherwise they wouldn't. Now, some of you may not like the positioning of your castle, and that's okay, because we can actually move our castle independently from our layer mask. So if I get out my move tool and start to move my castle, you notice, it's taking the mask with it. And that's not very helpful, especially when we're trying to realign things. These purple lines are indicating that my snap is on. If snap bothers you guys, you can go up to View in the menu bar, and you can turn off snap here. Okay, so to move the layer independent from its mask, we need to unlink the mask from the layer itself. And we do that by clicking the chain link in between the two. If I click that, the chain link goes away. Now be careful, because if you have the mask selected, like I do here, and you start to move what you think is the castle, you're actually moving the mask itself. And that gets kind of a weird headache. I'm going to undo that. When you unlink things, you want to be very careful that you're moving the actual image, not the mask itself. And now you can actually move the castle behind the mask and reposition it as you would like. You could even free transform this separate from the mask itself. I liked mine where it was, so I'm going to keep it there. All right, looking good so far. We have two more images we have to get in here. The first one is this grass tab. It's this kind of wooden footbridge. We're not going to do any isolations inside of the actual tab. We're going to go ahead and select this and copy and paste it into our Untitled 1 artboard. So let's go ahead and do that now. Select all, edit copy, jump tabs, edit paste. Now it's much too large, so let's go ahead and enter free transform to scale this down. Gives us our bounding box. I will scale while holding shift. If you're on the 2019 version of Photoshop, if you're on your personal computers, you do not have to hold shift as you scale. It does it proportionally automatically now. Holding shift will actually make it squash and stretch. So just something to keep note of as you guys work at home versus school. I'm going to scale this down, but so I can see it a little better, I'm going to turn the opacity down so I can see exactly where I'm placing it. I'm going to scale this down a little more until right about there. I'm going to hit enter to apply that and turn the opacity back up to 100. Now we're not going to do anything fancy to this. We're going to do a regular old new layer mask and use our paintbrush to paint off what isn't the footbridge. So on layer 1, go ahead and name that bridge. So on layer 1, go ahead and apply a brand new layer mask by clicking the Japan flag. Let's get out our brush tool. Make sure that we're defaulted to black and white by clicking the little black and white icon up here in the upper left of your color picker. Switch to black, and with a very soft and rather large brush, begin to paint off everything that isn't the footbridge. Okay, something kind of like that. Okay, let's do the same thing with our hikers. Let's go up to the Winter Hike tab. Let's select all, copy and paste it into our new artboard. Enter free transform, scale it down. Use opacity, place them. I tend to think they look pretty good right about here. Hit enter, turn the opacity back up. Let's name this layer Hikers. Apply a blank layer mask. And same thing as the bridge, use a large, soft brush with black to paint off everything that isn't the hikers. Thankfully, because they're on snow, it's going to be pretty forgiving in terms of what you do and do not isolate. Now, if for some reason your brush is not painting off entirely, like it looks like it's just making it more transparent and not completely going away, check the opacity of your actual brush tool up here in the option bar. You can see mine's set to 100%, which means it's removing 100% of the image. If this is for some reason set to like 50 or 40, you can see it really just paints off in more of a transparency, which we don't want. So make sure that this is set to 100%. And again, this doesn't have to be perfect because it's snow. The color's all off, but we'll fix the color later. That looks pretty good. Okay, so here we have a fully composed composite image. All of our tabs, except for the two overlays, and we'll get to those at the end, all of our tabs have been isolated and brought into one artboard for us to now color correct. Now would be a great time to save your PSDs, so that way if anything crashes, all that work we just did does not have to be repeated. Okay, great. So now I want to talk about color correction. Now, color correction really will start to make or break your composites. It's the great way to take all these separate layers and make them feel like they belong in one magical world. Now you can see that all these different layers have a whole bunch of different colors going on. The castle and the bridge are very warm with lots of reds and yellows. Our three mountain ranges are very different in color tones. The back is very cyan, the middle is very purple, and the front is very yellow. And the hiker's snow is very purple. So there's a lot of color correction that we're going to have to do to get this to work. Now I'm going to walk you guys through my color correction process. It's a series of 5 effects that I apply to almost every single image I ever work with, whether that's somebody's portrait or whether that's some kind of magical composite. Now, to start talking about color correction, I have to mention that there are 2 types: destructive color correction and non-destructive color correction. They're both necessary. I've been kind of demonizing the word destructive, but in this case, we have to apply destructive edits to our layers, and I'll explain why now. We have to make sure that each of these layers individually align in color. To do this, we have to go through layer by layer and do separate color correction effects to change each individual layer's color. So we can't just make broad sweeping changes to the entire image and hope that it works. It doesn't work that way. So we have to go through layer by layer. And to do that, we have to use destructive edits. Now, we can use non-destructive edits to change the color of the entire image, but I'll cover that in a little bit. Let's talk first about destructive color changes to each layer. Let's start with mountain middle. Now, when I start color correcting, I like to choose one layer to color correct everything else to. We're not color theorists, so if we just start randomly color correcting things, we're going to be changing things forever. So in this case, since mountain back is my foundation image, I'm going to use that as kind of my color palette, which means every other layer that I color correct, my ultimate goal is to make it match the look, feel, and color of mountain back. So for mountain middle then, let's select mountain middle in the layer panel. And let's start working through color correction. To access our destructive color correction edits, we have to go up to Image in the menu bar, go to the side menu called Adjustments, and now you see all these different color correction effects. Things like levels, curves, hue and saturation, black and white, invert, a whole bunch of fun things that you guys can play with on your own time. Now the 5 that I use every single time I work with color correction are the following: levels, hue and saturation, color balance, curves, and then I end with hue and saturation again. So I go in that order. So I'm going to walk you guys through each and every one of these, and I'll explain what they do and why as we walk through them. So let's begin with what's called levels. Now the goal of levels is to change the brightness and the contrast of the image. And your first thought may be, well, but there's an effect literally called brightness and contrast. We should probably use that, right? No. I like to say jokingly that brightness and contrast is for babies, and we're adults now, so we're going to use levels. Levels is the professional way of controlling contrast, whereas brightness and contrast is kind of the simpleton way. So let's use levels. So when you open up the levels dialog box, we see this weird looking graph. Someone from a previous section said, oh, it's a mountain because we're working with mountains, right? Unfortunately, it's not that easy. This is a exposure graph. It is read from left to right, left being pure black, right being pure white, and everything else in between. So when we see a spike here on the far left, this is our shadow values. This is communicating the darkness here in this peak. When we see the white values over here, it's communicating all the white that's over here on this side of the image. So it's important to know how to adjust levels based on our histogram. And this is called a histogram. These diamond plates down here, these sliders, these control our black values or our white values, respectively. Now, the proper way of setting a histogram is to change these little diamonds right to the point where the histogram starts. But that's if we were going for realism. And in a composite image, we're scarcely going for realism. We want to make this match mountain back. So let's keep cranking up our contrast. That looks pretty good. Now the colors are going to start to go completely weird. Don't panic. Levels controls contrast only. We'll deal with color later. Can you see how previously it was all washed out and kind of gray? And after, when we check the preview box, we can really see the contrast start to pop. That's what we're doing with levels. This middle slider here, these are our gray values. Leave those alone. You can see how it moves with our black and white tones. That's good. Gray tones can quickly start to jack with the overall color of the image, the overall tones of the image. So let's just keep that neutral at 1. Okay, now this is destructive. So once we hit OK, this is going to destructively apply itself to mountain middle, and that's OK. Go ahead and hit OK. So that's levels. All we're doing is adjusting the overall contrast and brightness of the image. So let's go back up to image adjustments, and let's move on to our second color correction tool called hue and saturation. Now we have 3 sliders here: hue, saturation, and lightness. Let's go ahead and forget that the lightness slider ever exists. It literally just makes things black and white. I don't know why it exists. I hate it, so we'll pretend it doesn't exist. Hue and saturation, though, are pretty important. The hue slider will change the overall color family of a layer, whereas the saturation will either saturate all the way till it breaks the color, or desaturate all the way to black and white or grayscale of a certain layer. Now, hue is great if you're trying to take a photo that was shot in spring to make it look like it was, taken in the fall, because you can really change kind of like leaves and nature. But be careful with adjusting hue when humans are involved. Human skin tones do not like to have their hues adjusted unless you're trying to make them look like they belong as a Smurf or in James Cameron's Avatar. In this case, I'm going to go -5 on my hue, maybe a little more, -7. You can see what that's doing here by checking this preview. We're trying to get it away from purple and more into the blue family. And I'm going to desaturate this because the background image is fairly desaturated. Now, don't just simply type in my numbers that I have on these effects. My monitor is calibrated. The monitors you guys work on at school aren't, which means my numbers here may look completely weird on your screen. That's okay. We can have a larger conversation about monitor color calibration later. For right now, just adjust these based on what looks good on your monitor. This looks good to me, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. All right, it's starting to look better. So that was levels for overall contrast adjustments, hue and saturation for kind of the color family and the vibrancy of color. And let's move on to our third, called color balance. Now, color balance is more or less the secret sauce of color correction, because it really allows us to start to bend and mold the different color tones of an image to work with our overall composite. Now, we have 3 sliders here with competing colors. I kind of think of each of these sliders as like a tug-of-war match between these colors: cyan and red, magenta and green, and yellow and blue. And the goal of color balance is to remove and add different colors in order to manipulate our ultimate color to our ultimate goal. For example, we're trying to match everything to mountain back. Well, we know mountain back has a lot of cyan, which means what should I add then to mountain middle? Cyan. And we do this in subtleties. If you go too far, you end up with a perfectly cyan mountain, and that looks terrible. -5 looks okay for me. There was quite a bit of purple in these mountains, so I'm going to kind of up the greens a little bit, not a lot, like +2. And I'll go and increase the blues +4. Very small shift, but it helps. Now you'll notice down here in the tone balance, we have 3 bubbles: midtones, shadows, and highlights. We can actually adjust these 3 tug-of-war lines across all 3 tonal ranges. So you'll notice when I click on shadows, it actually will default these back to 0. And now I'm adjusting the actual color balance of the shadow ranges, so the darker parts of the image. And then I'll do the highlights as well. Be careful with highlights though, it's a quick way to make things look really strange. Very subtle. Now, if it looks like it kind of resaturated the image, it's because it kind of did. And don't worry, we'll wrap up everything with another pass of hue and saturation. Okay, so play with color balance. And honestly, guys, the best way to learn any of these is to simply open it and just crank the sliders left and right until you kind of get an idea of what it's doing. Color balance took me years to kind of understand how to work quickly. So give yourself some time and some patience to drag these sliders around to manipulate them. Once you like where it's at, hit OK to apply it destructively. Okay, so we did levels for brightness and contrast, hue and saturation for color family and vibrancy, and color balance to force the actual balance into line. Let's move on to our fourth. Curves. Now, levels and curves are sisters. They both control brightness and contrast. I like to say, though, that curves is the more dramatic sister. So let's go ahead and click on curves. And let's see how this dramatically increases our contrast. Now, this looks just like levels, and you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that it does. We see a same histogram here. We see some very similar, these base plates down here. This, again, is controlling contrast. But we have this weird graph going on here, this line going diagonally through our histogram. This is our curve. Now, it's straight by default, so we have to add curves manually in order to control our black and white values. So this is read from left to right, which means from black to white, and it's read from bottom to top, from black to white. So if we want to control the contrast, we have to create what's called an S-curve. You photographers will kind of be familiar with what an S-curve is. Now go ahead and watch me work with the curves real quick, and then you guys can play with them. To start, we have to drop points along our line. I'm going to do one right here for the shadows, one here for the midtones, and one here for the highlights. Go ahead and click those three now. So now we control the curve by clicking and dragging these points. So you can see if I drag this point down, the overall darkness of the image increases. Don't do it to where it smashes the line. It tends to look pretty terrible. So I'll drag this down to increase my black tones, and I will drag my highlights up to increase my highlights, keeping my grays anchored in the middle. And now you can see this very subtle S shape. I'm bringing my black values down to increase them, and bringing my white values up to increase them. If I check the preview box on and off, you can see how much more dramatic that increased the contrast. Now, curves will naturally mess with the color of the image, and that's okay, because again, we're working with contrast here, not color. So go ahead and hit OK once you like your curve. And because this looks completely off in color, this is why we make one more pass with hue and saturation. So let's go back to image adjustments. And let's go to hue and saturation. Now I can desaturate the vibrancy of these mountain ranges. -40 looks good on my screen. And just like that, those mountains feel like they belong a whole lot more than they did when we first started. Now they're not perfect, and we'll adjust those a little more when we get into the actual dodging and burning. But for now, this looks pretty good. So that was 5 color correction tools: levels, hue and saturation, color balance, curves, and ending with hue and saturation again. Now, some of you are like, man, that was tedious. That was a lot. Do I really have to do that for every single layer now? Yes, you do. So color correction is very tedious. It can take a long time. We only have 5 layers to work with here. So, because we're not doing mountain back. But imagine having 30, 40 layers in a massive composite. You have to go through that process 30 to 40 times. So this takes time, and it takes some finagling to get those effects to look good. So give yourself some time and give yourself some patience. So let's move forward to mountain front now. Select it in the layer panel, and let's go through those same 5 steps. Image, adjustments. Let's start with levels. Increase the black values a little bit, not too much, and increase the white values a little bit. Just gives it a nice pop. Hit OK. Image, adjustments, hue and saturation. I'm not going to mess with the hue this time. I want to do all my color correction and color balancing. I'm going to desaturate this though, just a smidge. Hardly anything. Hit OK. Image, adjustments, color balance. Now the color value of this snow is not nearly as cyan or blue as it is up here. It's actually pretty yellow in terms of the midtones and the highlights. So we want to be able to remove yellow, and with yellow comes red. So we want to go into the cyan and into the blue. And we're going to do that for each tonal range, for the shadows and for the highlights. You guys can see I'm really doing things in very subtle increments. Don't feel like you have to adjust things. If it looks good without the adjustment, then don't make the adjustment. Much better. I'll go ahead and hit OK. Let's go to curves. Make our 3 points. Click, click, click. Black values down. White values up. Hit OK. Image, adjustments, and let's round out with hue and saturation. All right, so now this is looking like it all starts to belong. But let's move on to our castle. The castle and the bridge have very warm tones, lots of yellows, lots of reds. These are going to be quite tricky, or at least require more effort, to get them to start to blend in with these blues. So let me walk you through this process for the bridge, or for the castle, and then I'll let you guys try it for the bridge. So let's select castle. Let's go up to image, adjustments, and let's start with levels. Same thing, increase the black values to make it feel a little darker up there. And increase the whites a little bit. If we increase it too much, it starts to look like the castle's glowing. We don't want that, just a little bit of pop. It's looking good, hit OK. Image, adjustments, hue and saturation. This castle's pretty saturated. I'm going to desaturate it a little bit to get it a little more gray. Negative 36 looks good on my screen. Hit OK. image, adjustments, color balance, and this is where the work's going to cut out for us. What tones do we see here? Lots of yellows, lots of reds. So go the opposite direction here to remove those colors. Into the cyan, a lot. You're like, oh, that looks really weird. Yes, but now let's remove the yellow. And just like that, we have a castle going from warm to cool very quickly. Now again, it's a little too saturated, don't worry. We'll mess with curves and we'll come back and do hue and saturation again. So let's keep going. Let's do shadows. Again, do what looks good on your guys' screen. Okay, looks pretty good for me. I'm going to hit OK. Let's do curves. Click, click, click. Increase the black contrast a little bit, not a lot. We don't want to break it. And increase the whites just a little bit. Good. A slight S curve, hit OK. Now let's desaturate this one more time to match hue and saturation. And desaturate. And just like that, we have a castle that feels like it belongs rather than stands out. So why don't you guys repeat that process for the bridge? I'm going to go ahead and do it with you, but I'm not going to explain anything. I'm just going to kind of just rush through it. But why don't you guys try to repeat that? Okay, so hopefully now you have a decent looking bridge. Let's move on to the hikers. The hikers are actually pretty easy. All we have to do is kind of convert their purple snow into more of a cyan snow. And so we'll do that by using basic color balance. Kind of see how it matches a lot better. Now, if it doesn't match perfectly, you guys can always go through and refine your mask to get rid of more of those edges. Looks pretty good for me. So that was the destructive color correction process. And now we have this image that really starts to feel like all the elements are belonging together. It's not perfect yet, but at least everything feels like it belongs. So that's destructive color correction, layer by layer. But now let's say you saved this and you turned it in. And I said, hey, it looks great, but the entire image should be a little more yellow. So would you then have to go through layer by layer and add yellow to every single layer? No. This is where non-destructive color correction comes into play. And it comes into play in the form of adjustment layers. Let me explain. Let's go up to Layer in the menu bar. And let's come down to New Adjustment Layer. It's a side menu. And what do you see? All the exact same color correction effects. Levels, curves, hue and saturation, color balance. But here's the difference. Go ahead and watch my screen first. Adjustment layers don't apply a color correction to a specific layer, but instead makes a brand new layer itself. Watch. Let's say I wanted to do curves to add some dramatic pop to my overall image. I'll select curves. Brings up a new layer dialog box. I'll hit OK. And look, it created a brand new layer called curves. This is an adjustment layer. Adjustment layers affect everything beneath it, but they're non-destructive, meaning I could turn this on or off, I could delete it, I could come back and click on it and change the actual graph in the properties panel at any time. And the interface is the exact same. I'll make my 3 dots, I'll increase the contrast, and look, it's changing the contrast for the entirety of the image. Now here's what's even cooler about adjustment layers. Let's say I make an adjustment and I'm like, that looks great, but it's just a little too much. Well, sometimes it's really hard to fine-tune these curves, or any effect for that matter. But what do we have now to control how strong this effect is? Opacity. So we can come up here to the opacity slider and we can take it down a few notches. There, 40 looks pretty good. Before, after. So we're starting to add some dramatic pop, but we can fine tune it to the exact percentage that looks good. Let's do this again with hue and saturation. Layer, new adjustment layer, hue and saturation. Hit OK. I'm going to desaturate this. That looks kind of cool. We could do this with any number of effects. We don't necessarily have to go through all 5 over again, unless you wanted to. We don't have to. But for me, it's nice to know that I have full control over these if I needed them. So if I needed to go back to levels, or if I needed to go and do another hue and saturation layer, I could. And what's great is, if I was working for days on this because I'm so in love with this project, and I realize, I really don't like the hue, great. Simply click on that layer, and right up here in the properties, these sliders come right back. But again, these affect everything beneath them. So it's important to have adjustment layers at the top, unless you want them to only affect different layers. So those are adjustment layers. Now ultimately, I'll show you guys how we can use adjustment layers only, and we can start to avoid destructive color correction, but that will come later. All right, so the one thing we haven't talked about yet is dodging and burning in this example. So I want to talk about sun source real quick. I tried to be as nice to you guys as possible and choose images that all had the same sun location. So if you were to look at this image, where would you guys guess the sun is coming from? Yeah, the upper left, kind of up here. And we can see that because the sun's hitting here and all the shadows are on the right side of these layers. Shadows over here on the bridge, shadows coming over to the right of the hikers. As you guys start to source images for your own composite exercises and homework assignments, try to find images that have similar sun sources. It's really going to add some believability because we as humans are very used to single sun shadow sources. But sometimes, in cases like the castle, the image doesn't come with much directional light. In fact, the castle seems pretty neutral. So this is where we can start to use dodging and burning to add light sources where there previously weren't any. Now, if you guys remember, I showed you how to use the dodge and burn tool over here. It was the lollipop and the ha made you look tool. And then I said, let's forget those ever existed because they are destructive. So we're not going to use those. I showed you guys that secondary way by making a dodge and burn layer. So let's go ahead and do that now. Layer, new, layer. We had to change the mode to overlay and check the box. That kind of became my mantra, right? For dodge and burn layers. Mode to overlay, check the box. Mode to overlay, check the box. Hit OK. That creates a gray overlay layer. Visually, it changes nothing until we get out our brush tool, not our dodge and burn tool, but our brush tool, and we use black and white to burn and dodge respectively. Now I'm going to use black because I wanted to burn. Decrease my size to something more appropriate for the details. That looks pretty good. I want this castle to start looking like it's behind this mountain. To do that, I'm going to start to burn in some shadow where the mountain would interact with the castle. Now again, this is going to look like garbage at 100% opacity. It always will. So we come over here to opacity, we open the slider, we crank it down to 0, and we slowly increment this up. %, looks good to me. Now, because there's no sun necessarily, directional sun, in this castle image, we need to add it. I'm going to make a new dodge and burn layer. Layer, new layer. Mode to overlay. Check the box. And now, using alternating black and white brushes, I'm going to use white to dodge the areas of these spires that should have sun hitting them. I'm using my left and right square bracket keys to change the size of that as I go. Okay. Now again, it looks terrible, and it will, but watch. If I come over here to my opacity slider and crank this down to 0, and then slowly start to increase it, %, looks pretty good. Now we start to have directional lighting where there previously wasn't any. Now that castle is starting to look pretty well integrated into that mountain. Now we can go through and add a whole host of different dodge and burn layers. We could use some dodge and burn layers to further contrast mountain middle. We can use dodge and burn layers to emphasize the shadow faces on mountain front. We could even use a dodge and burn layer to kind of emphasize the cloud structures in the sky by painting black where there's black and white where there's white, and then changing the opacity to make that kind of pop. So why don't you guys play with the dodge and burn layers to really start to add light where there previously wasn't any, or to emphasize light where there previously is. And that way your image really starts to come to life. I'll let you guys play with that. So if you want to pause that and do that now, you can. I'm not going to do that for this example, but I'm going to move forward now. Okay, so we've done destructive layer by layer color correction. We've done overall image adjustments with our adjustment layers. And we use dodge and burn layers to start to add light and emphasize light and contrast. We're almost done. We have these two overlay layers, snow and smoke. Let's take our snow layer first. Let's select all, and let's copy it, and let's paste this into our Untitled 1 artboard. Now it's too small, and I told you to never, never, never scale up a raster image. However, for this case, let's go ahead and scale it up. Once you scale it up to fit your image, go ahead and hit OK, or hit Enter. Now remember, when we're adding environmental layers, we have to remove the black from the layer itself. And to do this, we have to use layer blending modes. If you guys remember from our example last week, we have to toggle down this menu that says Normal over here at the top of your layer panel. Select Screen. Screen removes anything that is black and leaves anything that is not. Cool, so now we're starting to get some weather happening here. Now if it's too intense, which I feel like it is, we can use the opacity to affect that. 40% looks good on my screen. We can do the same thing for smoke. Select all. Copy, paste. Apply screen. And then we can kind of decide where we want this to be. For me, I feel like it makes more sense being up in the sky like fog than being on the ground. So I'm going to enter free transform for this. And I'm simply just going to rotate it 180 degrees. Holding shift allows it to lock in perfect increments. There we go. I'm going to hit enter to apply. And it's too intense, so I'm going to turn that down just a bit. I don't like this glowy part. Let's scale it up a little bit. Yeah, it's better. And there we have it, guys. A color-corrected, environmented, that's a great word, cohesive composite image that started as 8 separate image tabs, and through isolations and color corrections and adjustments, we made everything feel like it belongs. It's a tedious process. This tutorial took me a little bit over an hour. So have at it, continue to play with it, rewatch parts of this tutorial to kind of get these in your head, because we're going to start doing this for homework and you guys are going to be doing this for your midterm. So practice, practice. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys did with this image. Go ahead and save this as a PSD and a PNG. Save the PSD for your own records so you can follow it for your midterm. And submit the PNG, the actual still graphic, on Canvas under this in-class exercise so you guys can get some points. Awesome, and I'll see you next time.